Hello, friends, family, and keepers of the faith, to another Del Boy blog. This one numbered 48, and we have reached week ending 22nd of January 2023. And my God, we're moving forward at some pace. And I got up this morning and looked out the window and saw the frost and thought to myself, do you know what? It's been a tough old month, really. I've started to feel a little bit in regards to the old purse strings. If you remember last week, I mentioned that I was paid half wages in December without knowing. And of course, that's meant that I've sort of like watched the pennies a little bit until we get to the end of the month. I'm pretty sure with all of the inflation and the energy bills and everything that it's a very difficult thing to do. But all I've had to do really is just keep an eye on things, move some of my money from a savings account into my normal account, and things will settle down when I get next paid. And the one thing that I really didn't want to do this year, and I'm really trying hard to do now, and that is not wish my life away to when the next payday is, because I've done that for so many years in my life, and I'm pretty sure you guys can relate that you try and set up your direct debits for a day or a couple of days after you're paid, and then you know exactly where you stand during the month. And then as you get towards the end of the month, you see your money slowly diminish a little bit, and then basically you're rushing to say, oh, I can't wait till next payday. The next payday comes along and it's a rinse and repeat for the next month. And that's wishing your life away. And I've got to learn to live each day as it is. So with that little ramble out the way, I think we know the format by now. Just want to wish, I hope everybody's had a great week. A couple of new people might be watching. Welcome to the channel. I hope it's going to have some subjects in it that's a little bit entertaining. And just before I move forward, I will just say that most of the time when I'm doing my blogs, I repeat what the blog is all about. And what I have to understand is it's a little bit like a new subscriber to a comic book, in that every blog that you do, you sometimes have to think along the lines of you're addressing somebody that's new and they've never seen your blog before. In other words, like a new person who's reading the book for the first time, even though there's a back history that you really need to cater for the people that continuously watch. So most of the time through here, you'll see that I'm doing shout outs and questions and all sorts of stuff. Those are the things I really look forward to. I'll do a little bit of knowledge that comes from me when I'm reading it. And this draws me actually to a very funny thing that happened this week. So I was speaking to Meister on the phone. Always a joy to listen to him on the phone. I always ask how he is. He fills me in with more personal things that's going on, so that it's just that I'm always interested to know that he's all right. You know, we all get to know him from the blog and the waffle that he does, but there is always the personal side, and I think it's very nice to ask how someone is. But I never got round to address the fact that in his blog on Friday, he addresses, his base by saying that he needs those questions, and we all do need them. But he says, I'm sure Del Boy cheats. And I laughed and chuckled, but it's also one of those things where cheat's a horrible word. And I think to myself, how do you cheat? What he was trying to get at, I think, is that I read the questions in advance, and I've mentioned it must be in 15 blogs out of my 48 that I read your comments every week and every day when they come through. But I tend to stay away from the question, and most of the comments that you give me a question at the end. That gives me the part where I can go, stop reading now, move to the next one. And it's called prep. If prep is cheating, well, great. But what I like to know in advance is whether I'm doing something right or whether I'm doing something wrong. And I think it would be wrong for me not to read your comments and not know whether something was a hit with you guys or whether something was poor in your eyes. So not cheating, and I definitely stay away from the questions, and I try to make that something that I will address on the day, because I like it to come from my head. The reason for that, even more imperative than any other blog that you might go, is that I need to stay sharp because because of work. And when you've been away from work for such a long period of time, your brain turns to mush. You need to be able to think on your feet. And I've been one of these people that for 30 years have had to have a question given to me, say on a support desk, and fix that problem instantly. And that's knowledge and thinking on your feet like that. And therefore, that's what I do with the questions. I need to think on my feet. So, if I don't know an answer, I say so. If I do know an answer, I'll give a best opinion as I possibly can. And most of it will be on the fly. There will be the odd one where I think it needs a bit of prep, this one. It all depends on whether somebody's put the question at the end or they accidentally put it in the middle, because you can't know until you start reading it. That's the thing. Always the way. So we know the format. Let's get cracking. It's the news. And as you know, we do the news because it date stamps this blog. When I refer back to it, I know exactly what was going on in the world, and it date stamps everything. So, and as you know, I keep the war in everybody's minds. This is what I read and learned about this week. The war. Air raid sirens were heard across Ukraine after Kiev rejected Putin's call for a Christmas truce. Request was to coincide with the Russian Orthodox Christmas, which is held on Friday and Saturday, just gone. So they have an Orthodox Christmas. So this was not from 3 or so weeks ago. This was this week. So Christmas held on Friday and Saturday, but Kiev rejected the request and called it a propaganda gesture. Now, I have to look at that and go, yeah, that could be looked at as a bit harsh. But I read the report a bit later on, and it says Joe Biden also expressed doubts of Russia's intent, being as they intended to bomb hospitals on the 25th of December and New Year's, and the New Year date, the 1st of this year. So here's Russia saying, please can we have a Christmas truce for our troops, because we have an Orthodox Christmas. And yet 3 weeks earlier we're going to bomb your hospitals. Yeah. I suppose it's a slow week to report anything, because last week I mentioned about the tanks being given by the UK, and I hope that NATO also start giving some artillery to try and win some parts of this war, whether it be by air or by tank or whatever. As you know, from our point of view, we just want the war to end. I've got no opinion other than, please, let's just end this, hopefully round a table with a talk. But I think we're heading away from that. So the next interesting article, and this is one that I read only a couple of days ago, and it was about kite flying. Now, it doesn't sound much like a news article, but this really made me read very closely what was being written. It says 6 dead an Indian kite festival. After sharpened strings cut throats. Of the 6, 3 were children. It is reported 176 were injured at the festival in, and I can't pronounce these, Gujarat. The festival marks the day when winter slowly turns to summer in the Indian calendar. And as I kept reading further on, I found out that it was a big sort of like competition type thing, you know, with the different type of kites that have flown in the air, and it's a lovely spectacle. But apparently there have been shenanigans going on over recent years where people have sabotaged kites. So some people have got it in their heads to use, instead of string, metal string, and some of them have rubbed glass powder into the string to make it sharper. And what this is naturally has done is caused injuries. And in this particular event, sadly, 6 died, and they were all from the tangles of the strings going around the throats of other kite flyers. What a sad thing. And to not cheat, but use things such as rubbing glass powder into string to make your string so sharp it cuts the other kites. I mean, what world are we living in? So I'll end that one there and give you food for thought. But I was looking at that and shocked and dismayed, I think, is the word that is something that comes to mind. And I didn't really read too much about anything else in the news because it was all about the strikes, which I've talked about before. I'm a big believer in the strikes. And we've already had one politician that just put it right and said that we as a nation now are used to strikes. We just recognise it now as being a bit of a disruption. But we really do need the government to pull their sort of like socks up a little bit. Now, I did go on my walk this week and I listened to Radio 5 Live a little bit if there's nothing for me to listen to blog-wise from Mainmeister or whoever else I listen to. And it had the Prime Minister's Questions, which is Wednesday at midday. And the roundabout nature of the politicians in regards to the unions, where Tories are expressing the fact that they don't get support for their bill to make things equal and fair, and saying that Labour have got the unions in their pockets. So they were going back and forth with the Labour leader turning around and saying, can the Prime Minister please answer how long he thinks it will take an ambulance to get to a person having a heart attack and he mentions a borough, for which then the Tories turn around and say, why won't Labour support our bill, and then we can be able to move forward with our plans of getting timings down with the ambulance service. And all Labour keeps doing is just saying, so he can't answer a straight question. Well, I'll tell him it's 1 hour 55 minutes and it's supposed to be 18 minutes, and while this person is having a heart attack on the floor, all you want to do is keep talking about policies and so forth, and then they just go back and forth. Politics annoys me. You never get a sensible or straight answer, but when the other person has asked the question and he hasn't got the straight answer, he then just continues to repeat, and you know that if Labour were in power, he'd be doing exactly the same thing. Please, Labour, do look at this bill if this is going to move things forward in regards to pay disputes. And the Tories, please just answer the question. You know, if you know it, if it's 1 hour and 20 minutes, don't be scared by saying it's 1 hour and 20 minutes at the moment, but we're trying to shorten that down. There's no harm in all of that. But anyway, that's the news out the way. And what do we do straight after the news? And just remember, that's just a date stamp. We do my shout-outs. And I love doing the shout-outs because anybody that leaves a comment for me, I believe deserves a shout out, because you've taken your time out of your day to just lay a comment that tells me whether you liked it, didn't like it, whatever, or actually ask a question. And it gives me great delight to answer those questions and read your comments. So shout outs this week. These are people that have just left a little note wishing me happy birthday or whatever, because it was my birthday a week or so back. So we've got 20th Century Gaming, Martroid, Lord Evil, Steve's Gaming, Scott Brion, LFC Gamer, Jambon, Robert's Retro Gaming, Ox, David Retro Gaming Played Badly, Mark Whatever. This is a new one. Can you introduce me as Joker? That's the name of the person. Colin Jones, Milfy Swimbuckle, and my old mate Denny. Thank you so much, you guys. You've entertained me with your words. Loved your happy birthdays. And the questions we're going to come across right now. So we might as well start, shall we? Now do remember that questions come in at a particular time and I have to shut off. And basically, if I'm not answering your question this week, it'll be in next week, but it's because you did it too late. Remember, I record this quite early on a Sunday. You can see the lights coming through. The light is any time from around about 7:30, 8 o'clock. I won't tell you the exact time at the moment, but take it like this. I've got a bloody jersey on because it's damn cold. Right, so first one we've got is Denny. Now, I'll just mention a few things about, because we love Denny. He's got his own channel, by the way. I do urge you all to look him out. But he always lays his comments out bullet pointed, absolutely lovely, things that he loved, things that he didn't love. He's been watching Vikings Valhalla Season 2. He's just about getting to the end of the TV show Halo, which was last year, and he's watching a film, The Pale Blue Eye, on Netflix, which leads into the twist at the end. He said it's got a really good twist. He's watching Retro Gaming Nation, Chinny Vision, 20th Century Gaming. He's watching all of those. He mentioned that he loved Glenn A. Larson, and mentioned about the idents, which I talked about last week being at the end of shows. I don't know if you can remember last week, but I mentioned a couple that were in there. Obviously, there's going to be a couple that I've got the ident wrong with the show, but you get the gist when I'm trying to do this. And he's even gone to the point of looking at all of the people's comments and coming up with his own answers, which is absolutely brilliant. He's answered some things from Jambom, Milfy, Steve's question from last week, Robert's question for last week, and he said he really loved the topic. And I hope you're going to like the topic this week, Denny. So he's got a question for this week. Have you ever considered writing a script for a TV show or starring in a TV or film as an extra? Well, I've never considered my English to be good enough to write a script. I've always thought about a plot line, but I don't think I can really turn it into anything. But anybody who knows me knows that at the beginning of my blog I mentioned that I was in a film, and it was a couple of years ago. It was a zombie film. This film company, which was a very low budget zombie film called Apocalypse, and I think it was renamed when it actually physically came out in the cinemas. And they took over the whole of our town, and they put an advert in. Anybody would like to be an extra, please be at this place on a particular day and time. But he also put a smaller ad saying, and if you'd like to be a detailed extra, an extra that's in the scenes not set in the town, please give this email, write to this email, for which I did. And the reason I did that was because I've been so engrossed with TV in my life and films. I wanted to be on the set and see a film being made. And I thought to myself, the best way, therefore, would be to be an extra. And I therefore put my name through. I said to him in there, I was quite happy to bring anybody from my hometown to the set if they needed to, because I've got a car, or drive anybody back if at the end of filming anybody needed to be returned. And I learned an awful lot. Now, just to be in a zombie flick where you're doing a lot of running and you're doing a lot of slouching and walking forward with dragging your leg and all of that sort of stuff, you're also trained by the stunt team, because you need to fall over properly and all of that sort of stuff without hurting yourself. And of course, anybody who knows me knows that I have had sciatica in 2005, so it was very important for me to listen to it. And to be quite honest, it was very entertaining and you learned an awful lot. It's the rushes that I really liked, and it was great that the director asked me to come behind the camera and see how a shot was being filmed. He then asked me to run towards the camera while chasing one of the people, and he instructed me on how my face should look and what he was looking for, and I did that. And then we did a great scene which was in an alleyway where the zombies had just broken through the fire doors. We were all walking through, stumbling over each other. And then there was a scene where the hero killed 6 of the people that came through the door. I was just knocked over. But he killed people while they were on the floor going forward with whatever equipment he had. I think he had a fire extinguisher and a broom handle, I think. He put a broom through somebody's head, but that was going to be done in post-optics at the end. When the film came out, I was in it for literally 1 second, and you see me fall over, and I think you can see my face just as, because he did a scene where the feet, you saw the feet walking through the fire door, would just all come through, and I was killed virtually instantly at the back end, so I was right near a flower pot near the door, and if you blinked, you'd missed it. But it wasn't the point. I wasn't in it so that I could be recognised. I was in makeup anyway, and I've got loads of pictures of me in makeup and all of that leading up to this filming, and it was just a great couple of days. The catering was lovely. I got to speak to some great people. We stayed in touch via a WhatsApp type thing where we set up our own little channel so that we could chat. Some of us have moved away now. Joffrey, I think he's the director, has moved on to other films. The film he did before this one was about rabid rabbits. But the interesting thing was he got the whole of the town involved, and everybody was an extra. It had thousands of people from my town all dressed up in makeup and running through the whole of the town and our precinct. And our precinct was very much like the precinct in Dawn of the Dead. So that was quite interesting. So I hope that answers your question. Thanks very much, Denny. It was a very interesting thing. I learnt an awful lot. And it'll always be in my memory, and I've got lots of photographs, so thanks very much. Then we've got Milfy Swimbuckle. Just excuse me while I just been talking quite a bit. He hasn't got a question for me apparently this week, more of an opinion, and he wanted to know what my opinion was, so I'm going to need to read this out. And he wished me a happy birthday. Thank you, Milfy. He said, I think a lot of Amiga owners might well disagree with me here, but I found that public domain games were the follow-up to what the Bedroom, Commodore 64 and Spectrum programmers were doing. What I mean is, a lot of the original games were made by just one guy with no company telling them what they could or could not do. And although you perhaps got a little less polish, I suspect you also got much more originality with these solo game makers, or a very small team of people, than you did with a lot of highly produced professional releases from the big companies. Of course there were exceptions, but I do wonder if some talented programmer was started in their craft due to joining a company that took the creativeness out of their hands. Yes. Now, I mentioned this to Main Master very, very early on, when after I'd been on as a guest in one of his blogs, his live streams, that a big part of me growing up with computers was Fred Fish and the public domain discs that came out. And what you have to remember is, if you bought an Amiga like I did, an A1000, where the latest game was coming out every 1 to 3 months, not weeks, and you just bought your new computer and you really couldn't afford the deluxe paints of this world, which were in the hundreds of pounds. Games that came out were expensive, were very mixed when it comes to quality. Fred Fish kept me alive because there were loads of people on the Amiga scene that had just bought their machine, quite highly talented people, and had wrote some little games and routines. So I was buying these Fred Fish discs, and they were literally like £3 a disc, and discs back then cost, a pound, £1.50 each, whatever. So really, you were paying a pittance, but you were buying them with not really knowing what was on the discs. They'd labelled them up. This is the utilities disc. This is the games disc. But games covers shoot 'em ups, sports games, strategy. So just having a games Fred Fish disc 232 didn't tell you much what was on it, or what the quality was like, or much other than, this runs on an expanded Amiga or not, or an unexpanded. So I must have bought, in that first year, 70 or 80 Fred Fish discs. And I'm with you that I'm pretty sure people that were coding onto these discs went on and worked for companies. And some of the quality of it was atrocious. But some of it was such great ideas. I remember there was this wire vector game that I've been trying to find the name of for donkey's years now, because I got this disc literally in the first couple of months. And it reminded me of Jeff Wayne's War of the World tripod, walking along a very triangle-y type ground, almost like the world. And these creatures went over the world like the crevice of a world, the circumference of the world, the horizon. So you could see the heads coming on, and you were all you had was a gun, so you were firing at everything, and it was all vectors, but it moved lovely. Well, it moved much faster than C64 vectors, which is what I was used to. And it was such an interesting premise, this small sort of like asteroid type world that was not very big, with the creatures being bigger than probably the asteroid itself, and then approaching over the top of this horizon line. Brilliant. And it might be my mind that bigs it up, but it was great, and I can't think of what it is. Really can't. So I hope that answers your question, Milfy. Yes, and I was part of the public domain scene almost immediately, or 6 months after me buying a disk drive for my Commodore 64. And I had a tape deck for the longest period of time. And I finally managed to buy a modem and entice my father into saying, I will pay the phone bill. Anything I use, it'll be on the phone bill. It'll be in the number. You'll see it. You can't miss it. I'll pay that. I'll pay it. And I was only on YTSs or something at the time. No, I might have even been at the end of school doing a little evening job to pay my way. So yes, I had to be very careful. And bulletin boards back in those days with the Commodore 64, it was bloody expensive to dial into them. The lines were very fragmented, and there were no point in you being on them unless you had a disk drive. Really, you needed to record that stuff as fast as you could onto a disk. Tape just didn't do it. So we've got past that one. Thank you very much, Milfy. You know, totally appreciate your questions. We get to Colin Jones. You know, Colin's great. He's done a blog, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. Nice to see him back. He's been incredibly busy. He said he remembers Manimal. Yes, I talked about Manimal last week. It wasn't, but he said it wasn't one he got into, and not because it was a short run. But he also mentioned Holmes and Yo-Yo, which was another couple of weeks back when I talked about that. But he's got my question for next blog. Have you tried any alternative operating systems? For me, being primarily Linux, Windows is alternative, but I've also dabbled with others in VirtualBox. I have an AROS install, play with it occasionally, and I've tried a few different Linux distros. That way, prompted my Dan Wood's recent MorphOS video. Yes, I have watched some of your videos, and you do go into some great depth, and to be quite honest, even I will learn because I can't know everything. But back in the day, I tried an awful lot of operating systems. I don't know, I didn't really do it like I've got my PC, so now I'm going to get another PC, wipe it and put the operating system on and play with it. I never really had the time to do that, or the money. Sometimes I never had two PCs, I just had the one because I had to sell my machines. I tend not to do that now. I've got my last 3 machines set up here, and my other 2 machines have got different operating systems on them, and I use them as a store. So I can basically watch a film off of my oldest PC, and it clears space on my primarily using PC, which I'm sitting in front of right now. But going back to the question, I first came across sort of like operating systems back in the day because we had Apple IIe's and Commodore PETs. Not really operating systems, more just the disk operating system. But when I became a manager, a configuration manager, I had a little bit more free reign. Now, when I was at school, we had Unix. Loved Unix, and because I grew in ranks a little bit with the school computers, I was able to not be an administrator, but I was able to watch how a Unix administrator would work on the school system, because you had to have a password and all of that, and they did it all through Unix. I was never a big fan of Linux. Linux, to me, is definitely something that I should take more interest in. But I've always found now that I'm a little bit older, long in the tooth, and I didn't have that awful amount of time for me to do things. But back in the day, I used to use a virtual system, and I used to go down to what they call bare bones. And I've mentioned this before, and that's where you put on a piece of software to virtually set up your machine, and you put another operating system on so that you can have 2 operating systems on the same PC. Very much like a WID would be at the probation's office, or a dumb terminal. When you log into a dumb terminal, you're logging into the desktop of that, not on the actual dumb terminal itself. It's the desktop of the server, and it's just your account and looking at a virtual desktop, which is why sometimes you get slow down and sometimes you don't. So when I talk about bare metal, I went below that and looked at the BIOS of an actual device, because I could tell in the virtual box that I had this type of motherboard, this much RAM, this operating system, this hard drive which was partitioned in this way, and that meant I could learn the intricacies of BIOS without actually going into a PC and cocking it all up. So yes, I have done that sort of thing, Colin, but not really putting different operating systems on. I've dabbled with different Amiga operating systems when I had my Amiga, more my Amiga 4000 than it was my 2000, because I didn't care by then, and I was moving into PCs, and I wanted to see what other people had written. and I was more interested into their apps. And later on, when I've set up Pis with Amigas on, I've not necessarily put Workbench 2 on or 1.3. I've actually used different Amiga OS's variations. But when it comes to Windows, I've just stuck with vanilla, and I just basically manipulate my Windows to be as fast as possible by taking the bloatware away. So I hope that answers your question, Colin. Very interesting. Thank you so much. And everybody, thank you for all of your support. And Colin, talk about your blog later on. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you. And then we get to LFC. Now, he's apologised for a lack of questions over the last couple of weeks. But basically, his question this week was, apologies for the lack of questions, and to make up for the lost ground, here we go. My question is, aside from beating Spurs in the FA Cup final in 1987, yes, I did talk about that, and I was there, brilliant day. What are some of your other favourite matches and moments being a Coventry supporter? Oh, wow. Now, this is where I could prep better and show you some of my programmes, right? But I'm not going to talk about... I mean, it's wonderful going to a football match, and I miss going to them a little bit. It's been a difficult thing to do, actually, being a Coventry supporter or for as many years as I have, because they sold their grounds, moved into the Rico, then they were pushed out of their grounds. They then had to hire a ground to be where they were playing their game while the other home team were playing away. It got very, very convoluted. And to be quite honest, the nice thing is I have been to the Rico ground. I did go to the Coventry's old ground before it was torn down. So I've seen a lot of things in my life. But the things that come to mind when you say the FA Cup, the instant thing that comes to me after the FA Cup was how stupid we were to lose. I think it was like 18 months later, our game to Sutton United, I think it was. And this was in 1989. They were knocked out of the FA Cup in the third round, the very first round that Coventry were playing in for the FA Cup's round scheme. If you're in the Premiership, you see, you never joined it until the third round. So yes, there was no Premiership then, so it would have been the First Division. And they lost to Sutton. That was an awful day, and it wasn't at the Coventry ground, so Sutton were very excited, and they were going to go and play the next team, and hopefully at a bigger ground, where all of these lower teams suddenly get a lot of revenue in. So I'm a big fan of the FA Cup for that. But I always remember going to grounds, and my father would always tell me about certain players. And I remember in the 90s going to see, I think it was Blackburn Rovers LFC, and the reason I mentioned them is it was Shearer that was playing for Blackburn Rovers at the time, so they were playing against Coventry, and my dad would say, just watch Shearer, you watch him, he'll be goal hanging. Now that's a word that I'd come across before at school when they were teaching football, and I was watching there for Shearer an awful lot, missing a lot of the game because I just wanted to know what this guy was doing. And lo and behold, Shearer was quite high up on the pitch, but always at the point of not being offside. And Blackburn at the time were playing the long game. They were playing long balls up, rather than passing closely. And they kicked the ball to Shearer, no word of a lie, and he was literally in the goal mouth virtually. I mean, he was in the penalty square, kicked the ball in, and we were 1-0 down. Never recovered from that. And my dad turned around and said, "That's goal hanging." And then that made me sort of like research a little bit more. I went to libraries about goal hanging, and I was told that certain players were accused of goal hanging. I believe uncharacteristically and wrongly, Greavesy was considered to be a goal hanger. Shearer, though, on that day definitely was goal hanging. I hope that gives you some memories. I know it's not an awful lot, but yes, I do miss some of those days. I also miss the chanting. I'll never forget the first time I went to the Coventry game. I remember the chant, but it was something like, they look in the dustbins for something to eat, they find a dead rat and they think it's a treat, down in the, and then it was the opposition's team, down in the Spurs home or something like that. And never forget that. Brilliant times. Thank you very much for that memory, LFC. So then we come to Scott Briam. Thanks very much, Scott. Another great blog. Quick question. What's your least favourite soft drink and your least favourite crisps? Oh, God. So I think I've mentioned before about favourite crisps and stuff during a lot of questions that happened in my early side of the blog. But just to answer quickly, soft drink. I do drink a lot of soft drinks, and I do like fizzy drinks, and it's bad for me, but I know that. But I can't stand grapefruit juice. Something about the, it's so bitter. It's not really a soft drink. It's good for you. I like pure orange juice. Can't stand grapefruit juice. So I suppose anything that's probably got grapefruit as, as a cordial, I wouldn't like. Least favourite crisps. I've tried many different crisps. I'm not a big fan of these ones that are very hot, like paprika, where they've got paprika in there. And I remember they came out with very experimental crisps very early on. They had hedgehog flavoured crisps. And I remember they tasted more like a off Marmite flavour. I like Marmite, but these hedgehog crisps were bloody horrible. But just as a general answer, I like tangy things. I don't like things to be too hot. Paprika crisps, I just don't like. I just don't like them. I love those Doritos Cools. They're the blue packet Doritos, and I do like the different flavoured Pringles. They're quite nice as well. But I'm a big plain fan. I like ready salted. I like prawn cocktail, Worcester sauce flavour. Oh, Worcester sauce flavour, that's gorgeous. Prawn cocktail. I love those. Yeah. Cheese and onion. Not a big fan of chicken, but I do like smoky bacon. Yeah, the list goes on. Robert's Retro Gaming. First of all, he says, I certainly wasn't trying to revive Foodgate. No, Robert, I didn't express to you that that's what was happening, although you've just seen me answer another food question. It literally was, I don't want the floodgates opening for that again, because, well, to be quite honest, I mentioned it last week, I'm a fat person and quite a weight. I'm very conscious of when people were watching me eat. Like, it was like, look at him shoveling more chips into his gob and all of that sort of stuff. So I shy away a little bit about talking about food. But enough of that, Robert. Thank you very much for your question. And you've said this week, as I'm back to work after a few weeks off, I find myself fantasizing about retirement again. Still a number of years away for me, I'm afraid. On a related note, what would be your dream job? And I think I've mentioned it before, I always wanted to be an editor of a film. But just before we move past that, I don't know if my camera will pick it up, but I'm constantly thinking about retirement. I'm going to see if I can bring it up on my phone. But on my phone I've got a little countdown clock, and I don't know if I can get it into focus. I don't think I can. But the one in the middle there tells you that it's 16 years, 5 days, 30 minutes and a second, 5 hours, 30 minutes and a second before I retire. And that counts down daily. I'm not drastically counting down my retirement, but I found it a fun little app that I thought I'm going to put on there, and I put in my birthday date of when I get to 70. But of course, by the time I get to 70, they'll have moved the goalpost and it'll be 72 before I can retire. But dream job, yes. I always wanted to be an editor of the film, and I expressed the reason for that, and not to be the director, was because I'd see the whole of the film and I would be cutting it down to the point where it would become the production release, you know, the actual film that everybody would see. But I would have seen all the bits that were filmed around it. You know, the bits that were cut out, the reasoning, why it was being cut out, whether it be for time, the narrative, whatever. That would be my dream job, yes. But out of context, you know, a job that, in other words, a job that I could possibly do. It's always been a dream of mine to be an IT manager. I'm in the field of IT. I've been an asset and configuration manager. It'd be great to be an IT manager of a team, you know. But you tend to find they're not called IT managers now. They're CEOs, and CEOs come in, get the IT department to the point where it's like a production line and they're not required anymore, and then they go off. I don't want to be a CEO. I'd just like to be the manager of the IT team, go to those meetings about security, refresh programs, talk to all of the heads about what's going on, do the budgets, all of that sort of stuff. So yes, that would be something I'd love to do. And it's something that when I used to have my yearly reviews, I used to say, that's my 5-year plan, yeah, to be an IT manager. I used to hate it because I'd usually be speaking to the IT manager. And it's not great to go in there and say, yeah, one of the great aspirations is for me to have your job, mate. Yeah. Not going to get you very far. Thank you very much, Robert, and I hope that answers your question. Martroyd has now got one here for me. Thanks, Martroyd. He was talking about Jeff Minter's Revenge of the Mutant Camels recently being bug fixed and so forth. So he's put, in doing so, I finally managed to complete the game close to 40 years after its release, and I'm over the moon about it. But he's got a question. Are there any old games that you may have struggled with back in the day but revisited and managed to complete as a sort of a bucket list item? Hope that makes some sort of sense. And to be perfectly honest, Martroyd, and I'm so sorry that this is a boring answer, I haven't got a bucket list of games I want to go back to and complete. Back in the day, I would have always have had that mindset. I'll come back to this game. It's too hard. I'm going to learn a little bit more about it. I'm going to have more time to go on it and complete it. And I'm pretty sure Mainmeister has said the same thing. Some games are so short that you can complete them, and so long that you'll never get to the end. And some are so complex that you can't do it in that weekend. And then when you get to the next weekend, you can't remember the controls, and it puts you off. Which is why we put the short little games on. And the short ones don't tend to have an end. You know, they're just shoot 'em up high score table things. So, thinking a little bit, possibly I'd like to go back to the Command & Conquer range of games, because I was a big real-time strategy person, and possibly finish a series rather than finish the games. If anybody's looked at my Steam library, you'll see that Supreme Commander was one of my favourite games, and you'll see I put over 100 hours. I actually finished all the missions, and I was doing skirmishes towards the end. And I did finish an awful lot of the Command & Conquer games, but not every single one. And there was a special set of real-time strategy games, and I think they were called Rise of Nations, which then turned into Rise of Legends. That was a great series. And I remember they turned the servers off before I could finish the game. You can now play that game without the servers, and because they basically, there's a patch that takes the need away for that for a check. I think I'd like to go back and play Rise of Nations. So I hope that's a good answer to you. Thanks very much for the question. And then we get to 20th Century Gaming. He's put a question for me. Thanks very much, Mark. If you had a time machine and could witness 3 historical time periods or events, what would they be? Past, present, and subjectively the future. And I think about this again as well, Mark. But just to answer quickly, and I hope not too quickly that you feel that I'm just pushing past yours. If I had a time machine, I'm not really big on looking at things too far, but I always said that I'd like to watch the moon landing because I was born in that year. Well, not actually that year, actually, it was around that year, but I was too young. okay? And although I've seen lots of broadcasts and there's been everything about the moon landing, I was never a toddler that comes down and can remember it on TV at the time. The trouble with going back in time is you go back in with your brain as it is now. You can't put your brain back to how you would have been at that particular time. A bit like Scrooged watching. If you ever watched the film Scrooged, you'll know he goes back to Christmas past. He's looking at it with his adult eyes, but watching himself as a child opening those Christmas presents. You want to be going back in time, being that little boy, not really watching. Because you can't put yourself back in those eyes, and that's why we have that rose-tinted glasses type thing. But yes, the moon landing. I'd love to go back and see how the pyramids were built. There's lots of things like that I'd like to have. JFK, when he was shot, I'd like to be a fly on the wall for that. But he's also put subjectively in the future. Now, when it comes to the future, I wouldn't know quite how far forward I'd like to go. But I would like to see not too distant future, say about 40 years after my... If I thought of myself as living to 80, I'd probably like to go forward 40 years after the death of me. So I would have been 120 then. And see what advances we'd got with TV, what advances we'd got with film, whether we even watch films. I wouldn't still expect flying cars anymore, but it'd be interesting to know what the car system would be. But there's a good few years of me left. So I'd love to know what games, how do we play games now in the future? Yeah, there would be. Going forward in time is just as important as going back if you ever watch Back to the Future. And there would be, so I hope I've answered it quite comprehensively, because I've mentioned a few things in the back, but I've also mentioned a few things in the future. So that's great. Thanks very much for that. And we've got Jambon. So thanks, Jambon. He was talking about Sid James and don't give up my day job with trying to do his laugh, and that I thought it was quite a good impersonation of the laugh of Sid James. But his question: are you a fan of Western movies, as in the Wild West? If so, what are some of your favourites? Thanks again. And I've talked about Westerns as being, yes, one of my favourites. Once Upon a Time in the West, A Fistful of Dollars, A Few Dollars More, all of the spaghetti westerns, I've watched those. How the West Was Won, brilliant. So many westerns. Who Shot Liberty Valance? Some of them, they're based around rustling cattle and all of that sort of stuff. Not a particularly interesting story. Also, probably not well-known actors. But I do watch those, and they're more like episodes of watching Rawhide or something than an actual film. And I don't get great enjoyment out of watching those. But Once Upon a Time in the West is such a fantastic film. And I think what draws me to it as well is the scores, the music scores that are in westerns. Some of them are, very lackluster. But Once Upon a Time in the West, A Few Dollars More, all of those, brilliant soundtracks. And I can put those soundtracks on, especially like an Ennio Morricone album or something like that, and get great enjoyment. And I can almost see the actual film by just listening to the music. It's very... I don't think maybe a lot of you guys don't do that, but I'll listen to a soundtrack without watching the film, and I can picture in my mind exactly what's going on. I know the beat of the score. So that's great. Hope that answers your question. Let me just get some product placement here. And then we get to Steve. Oh, Steve. So he's put, I'll just throw in right now, Have you ever stayed up all night just to play a game? And if so, what game was it? So thanks, Steve, for your question. Yes, I love your comments. You know, I love those. Definitely loved reminiscing about Bob Monkhouse. Sorry, I get some details wrong. I think I can get morbid sometimes because of a person dying, but I do remember that when somebody dies, they then do a homage in the weeks afterwards. And they always show the last broadcast that they did. And I mentioned that Bob was chatting to another comedian. And I was trying to and ahhing about whether it was a Sid something or other. I'm pretty sure now it was Mike Yarwood that he was talking to. He was talking about his club days. But anyway, to get back to your question, of course, Guild Wars took up all of my time, and I've mentioned Guild Wars before, that I'll just do something. And I said that the game is dangerous because it makes you do everyday things in the game. And I remember looking at the clock and it was 4 in the morning and I had to be up at work for 8. And how I was going to be the next day. But even going back into the 8-bit days where I was playing Elite, that would be happening to me. It would generally be around a puzzle game, or a game like, or a strategy game like Supremacy, or Megalomania, or some of these, the Amiga days where there was a Populous type game, and I would start it off and I'd get so engrossed that then when I suddenly looked at the clock, I was going, oh my God, I'm going to be dead in the morning. And, and it just threw me. But it would always be based around something that was a little bit more complex than the norm. I think another one that springs to mind was the Sentinel on the Commodore 64. Fell in love with that game. And I played that to death. And I do remember starting a very early session, something like 9 or 10 o'clock in the evening, when I was about 15, thinking, oh, I'll just do one. And I ended up doing 10 or 15 levels. I was just on a kick. I was on a lucky streak, and I didn't want to stop because my brain must have been in the groove. You know what I mean, to play in that game. That's the end of the questions, I believe. Now, if I have missed any, I do apologise. But like I say, I do have a deadline. I do cut things off around about 7 o'clock on a Saturday. And so I sort of have to move on a little bit. So we get to now what I've watched on YouTube. And the score on these. I don't tend to move away too much, but I do try and build some odd ones in. So this week in retro, I always watch that religiously. They were talking about Atari consoles like I did last week, and Monkey Island. The new one is being brought out in a big box, and they were discussing, is it worth it? That was quite interesting. Then we've got LGR. Now I watch him on occasion. He's a great bloke, but he talks more about PCs than anything, and all the old cards that we used to buy. And that's a great thing for me because we don't talk an awful lot about PCs. We talk about our old 8-bit days and all that sort of stuff, but we mustn't forget that there was the beginning era of you moving to your first PC. And depending on your technical ability, you'll remember swapping out graphic cards, sound cards, network cards, memory, and operating DOS for the first time, and then having your first Windows operating system on, and so forth. They're equally just as got some nostalgia for me, anyway, because PCs are my career, in a way, because I'm, working with networks. So he talked about Motocross Madness 25 years later, which, not an interesting article really for me to watch. Motocross Madness is a biking game, but it's still interesting because of the spec of the machine he was running it on, those days of OpenGL, all of that sort of stuff. So that was great. Then I watched Movie Collector. Now, Movie Collector's great. I know him by name, and we have sort of like little chats. But he was talking about silent running, and why film has grain, and why that film probably isn't as sharp as say, another film that's had the 4K treatment, and why there is more grain. And you have to remember, it's all about film stock, how light goes through the chamber when it's being passed down past the lens for it to be projected onto the screen, all of that sort of stuff. And of course, low stock, whether your budget allowed you to buy a certain grade of film. Yes, of course. If you're filming in low level, you've got a lower grade type of film, you've got a camera that only has certain capabilities, that can only let in certain amount of light, you'll get grain. Doesn't matter whether you can upscale it or not to 4K, that grain will be there. Never forget that, lads. If you're ever wondering why 4K is not pristine, even though it's come from film, there is certain grades of film stock. Then there's been a lot of talk, mostly because of Steve, really, that's made me reminisce about PC building. So I went to a YouTube channel where he's actually called PC Builder, and he was talking about GPU prices this year, when it's best to buy equipment, and how to pick your PC parts in the year 2023. Very interesting, because the GPU market is very volatile at the moment. There are seasons where parts of the year where it's best for you to buy your CPU, sometimes not best at the beginning of the year, sometimes it'll be a couple of weeks after the recent batch of CPUs are released, because the old ones go down in price. And how to pick parts is very interesting, because as I was mentioning to Steve and other people that just asked me questions about PC parts, you don't want to bottleneck your PC when you're talking about budgets and how you're gonna build your PC. So you want to have a little bit of expansion, even though you're not thinking right now that you're ever going to expand it. There will be a time where that little bit of extra memory is going to be needed. That drive is going to want to be the later or newer SSD drive for that little bit extra speed and so forth. And PCs are not cheap these days, so I always tend to buy my machine with 2 years in mind, and it's about time I built mine. So that's the reason why I started to watch those. And then I watched another channel, Boxing Matrix, and that's just because I've started to watch some boxing documentaries again, you know, like What Is My Name, which is a Muhammad Ali documentary in 2 parts, and all of that sort of stuff. There was a George Foreman one on the other day. A couple of months, or 6 months or so back, I watched the Tyson Bruno documentary. So this was the 25 knockouts they should have censored. Now, how you can censor a boxing match, I don't know. If somebody punches somebody out, it's going to happen in a flash. The camera, if it picks it up, shows the brutality of the sport. But I watched it, and some of those knockouts, oh my God, they'd have knocked me back to my ancients. Do you know what I mean? So that was very interesting. So then I'm moving on now to what I've watched of you guys. So we get to Ponder and his blog 46, and it was a very interesting blog. It was great to see him back. He was talking about the passions, you know, about what he likes and so forth, and some of the things that are happening to him with customer services and all of that sort of stuff. And this is what I mean about the essence of a blog. It should be a warts and all, things that are infuriating you, things that are making you happy, raising some questions in your own life about what do you think about customer support and so forth. Absolutely wonderful. Glad to see you back. A couple of people commented to say that you looked a bit tired. Hey, you're a busy man. I do hope, though, that you're in good health and you're a bit sleepy. I did notice a little bit about your face that seemed to think you hadn't had some sleep. But all I could say was I was just so glad to see you back, because it was great to watch something again from you, because I've missed so many little things that have happened on Twitch. You're one of the go-to guys when I go to watch something, so thanks very much. And then we come to another go-to guy, which is Mainmeister. Now, he did 2. He did a 10-minute mashup of Whizball, and he did a 5-credit challenge on Raiden. Both of them I commented on. Brilliant little videos. I know Whizball is one of his favourite games, so it was interesting to see a 10-minute mashup, which actually ended up being about 20 odd minutes, because he's quite good at that game, and he's quite good at a lot of games. You have to give him a lot of credit, really. When he's doing when I knock him and say, will you get to level 2 and that, you got to remember somebody is saying to him, play this game. Hasn't seen it for either years or never seen it at all, doesn't know the instructions, play the game. Now you go away now, do a randomizer in a spreadsheet or something, put 250 games in there, randomly let it choose a game for you. You load it up and play it and see whether you get to level 2. Not easy. And I can tell you now, having my own channel and playing games, not easy. Not easy at all. So it was great that he did his Raiden challenge. I put an idea to him to say, if you want to know whether you're getting better or worse in a game, instead of putting in your initials, you can put first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and then you'll know that on the 5th credit, if it's right at the top, that was you improving. If your 3rd go on the game was at the top, then you knew that you improved at the middle part of your experience of 5 credits, and that you drifted off. Whatever. Just a little bit of banter and advice. I do like to offer an alternative way of doing something. You can either take it or not. Hope you like that. Then we get down the rabbit hole. Now he's been busy. Oh my God. He started off with his OB Windows, talking about password security. Very apt. We should have a lot more people doing a jokey password thing, which is very informative. I added my own little bit to his comments as well in there, because he talked about the strength of a password, 8 characters, all of that sort of stuff. When I had to do inductions, because I was the person that handed over the equipment to the probation staff, I always said some of the best passwords in the world are not your favourite word with letters and numbers change, letters change to numbers and so forth, although that's a very powerful thing. Sometimes it would be best to have a phrase, and you take the letter of the first word of a phrase. So one of your phrases could be, this is my password, do not use. And that's a very simple one that I used to use at inductions, and that would make the password unreadable, because it's this T is I my M password P. So you already got TIMP, TIMP. You know what I mean? But you're not thinking the letter. You're not thinking of a word. Like my favourite word, could be, I don't know, Pontiac or something, right? You've got a word that isn't even in the dictionary, made up by a phrase. And then you could go one step further and turn I's into ones, E's into threes, etc., etc. So, very good article that was. And then he bought himself a racing wheel, which was very interesting to me, because the last racing wheel I bought was a Thrustmaster one, and it was so heavy you had to G-clamp it to your desk. And to be quite honest, with all the faffing about, I hardly ever used it, because it was like, I can't be asked to get this damn thing out. And he had got one that sits on your lap. And I was interested to know, I'd like him to do an article on that 6 months down the line after constant use, because it had wings that came out and gripped around your leg. And if I know anything, if you've also got an accelerator and a brake, your muscles will be tightening around your lap. And I'm pretty sure that your legs would slowly drift apart, putting pressure on those wings. I'd love to know if they snap off. So that was interesting. And then he did a raid on Vectexia, I think Vecteria, which he thought looked like Desert Strike for the Vectrex, but I thought it looked like Raid over Bungling Bay. Because Raid over Bungling Bay was one of my favourite Commodore 64 games, and he had to bomb factories and land on a helicarrier on the sea. And that pointed to me to say, that's not Desert Strike, that's Bungling Bay. And that was brilliant, because that came to me the instant, or literally a minute into the video. Then we get to Robert's Retro Gaming. What a great guy Robert is. He continues to do his Dwarf Fortress game, which I'm not watching so much because I don't have the game, but I also know of the game, and I think he's doing it like a tutorial type thing. I think I might go and actually start watching a few just to see if that's what it is, because you shouldn't not watch something because you have no interest in it. Sometimes there might be something in it that you'll pick up. But I watched his Eagle's Nest, and that brought me back some memories into the Eagle's Nest, because he showed the Atari 8-bit version and I played the Amiga version. So it was interesting to see whether they manipulated the Atari 8-bit version based on the fact that I always remembered the 16-bit. And they hadn't. It was actually looking pretty close to the 16-bit version. So that was absolutely brilliant. Do go and watch Robert's Retro Channel for anything 8-bit. Absolutely brilliant. And of course he did his Minecraft. I think we're up to episode 65. So you'd have a lot of catching up to do if you want to watch his Minecraft stuff. And then we've got David Retro's Games Played Badly. And he was showing off his PS1 collection. Very interesting to do these. Some people think of them as very boring. I tend to find that they're great if they bring their own personality into it. And David was reading off these games one by one, getting them out of a box, showing you the box, and then putting it down. And he must have brought out over 100 PS1 games. But each time he came across one that was a favourite, he would then start talking about it and reminiscing about it. Very interested to see that he doesn't have quite some of the games that I would have chosen. I didn't see one superhero one in his collection, but he also stated that it's very rare for him to buy a game, the same game on another system. So Spider-Man was on the Dreamcast. He might have had that in the Dreamcast rather than the PS1. I need to go back and look at some of his videos, so I'll be doing that. And then we move to TV. So what have I been watching this week? Well, not an awful lot. I watched The Last of Us, which, as anybody will know, is a game which has now been turned into a TV series. It was the first episode and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Definitely one to watch. I'm looking forward to, I think there's 8 or 9 episodes in this. And like I say, this is probably a really good time that if you've never played the game, to go and watch the episode and then start playing the game and see how close it is to the actual production. Especially if you've never played it. That's a very good point. Might make you go back and play the game. Don't go too far ahead though. You want to enjoy the production of the show. But because of that and because of my eyesight, I've watched on and off an old show called Petrocelli. Now, don't know if anybody will remember Petrocelli because it is a very old 1970s show, but it's very much a lawyer show rather than a cop show. Petrocelli moved away from the city into a small town in Arizona, because he didn't want to. He wanted to sort of like have a job and a new start somewhere. And the thing about it is that it only lasted 2 seasons, but there was about 40 odd episodes. He started to build this house, and me and my mum back in the day, she would watch the program or come in late, and the first question she'd ask me is, how far has he got with building this house? And he was never more than about 3 bricks high on this house. He'd only got the foundation stones, and every week my mum would come in and said, has he built that house yet? Has he built that house yet? Has he got more than 3 bricks high yet with this house? So I mentioned it to my mum and I said, Mum, I watched Petrocelli today. And she said, oh yeah, how's he getting on with that house? It's just so funny because my mum remembered that about the show. Amazing. Not the brilliant show, definitely one to watch. I've got happy memories of watching Petrocelli, like I've got happy memories watching Columbo or any of those types of shows. What have I played? Played a few games to try and get my eyesight better. So the games I've been playing are 2112 Tower Defense or 2112 TD. Don't play many Tower Defense games. I find them very boring, but loved it. That's been a sort of like a little 10-minute mashup game for me to go on to. I played Mini Motor Racing Evo because I wanted to play a top-down racing game to try out my controllers to see whether the accuracy was quite good. And there's also a VR version of that game, and I've got both of them in my Steam library. So I loaded that up. Geometry Wars 3, same rhyme and reason, wanted to test out my controller. And Geometry Wars, what a game. Love twin shooters. That game, though, my God, I must have missed it because I've played Geometry Wars 1 and I remember it vividly. Geometry Wars 2, remember that vividly. I think there was a Geometry Wars Evo, which I played a little bit of. And Geometry Wars 3, I don't think I ever played. And this is a brilliant game, absolutely fantastic. It's a little gem. It was in my library. I don't know how much it is now. It could be in a sale. But definitely if you're into your twin shooters, Geometry Wars 3 surprised me this week of being just what a fantastic game that is. And then I've been on a little bit more on the Valheim server on the hope to see my buddy Rocket. But I haven't seen him this week. I think he's probably very busy at work. So my thanks and my hellos to Rocket. I hope he's okay. That's a special message to him. And just to let him know, I've started building a very big plot of land near the Mistlands, so that when we do both go up to the Mistlands, we're in a nice comfortable home with plenty of items like iron and silver and so forth, made out of brick, so that we don't get demolished easily. So we don't have to travel all around the world to get to the bits. That's what I've been doing, clearing a bit of land. Just a prep. And then what have I been doing? Well, I did my blog, as you know, and this week I did manage to get a video out because Steve, for my birthday, very nice of him, bought me Yars Recharged. Don't get many birthday presents, and that cheered me up no end. It was really, really nice of him. Thank you so much for introducing me to a game that you think that I would like, first of all, and just for the thought of being a mate and buying me something. So I did my review of it. I was a bit concerned, but I thought, how can I badmouth a game that somebody's just bought me? But actually, I was pleasantly surprised that it was a good game. But I want you to watch the review rather than me talk about it here. But I will turn around and say, it's a good game, but it shouldn't have the name Yars in it. And then I'll let you watch the rest. So then we get to the topic. Now, I have noticed the time. I've gone well over. But I'm going to do the topic because it took me 4 hours of research. So I'll go as slow or as fast as I need. But I really enjoyed the research on this. And this is going back to an old TV show. And the reason I'm doing it is because it turned up so many times in my diary when I've been researching my gaming history. And the show is Starsky and Hutch. Okay, so we're talking about Starsky and Hutch this week. Ran for 4 seasons, 93 episodes with one 72-minute movie, and it ran from 1975 to 1979 in America. The UK did not get it until April 76, so a good year afterwards. And we've had repeats of it every now and again, and it's now on our satellite channels, usually on something like That's TV or Yesteryear or something like that, Legend, that sort of stuff. They did a complete run of it last year, I believe, and that's the last time that I watched it. Produced by Spelling and Goldberg producers. That's Aaron Spelling and Leonard Goldberg. Now, the names may ring bells with you, but if they don't, these two people set up that company and they did an awful lot of shows. They ran from 1972 to 1986, and that's a big chunk of TV history. And if I was to mention some of the shows, they would be TJ Hooker, Charlie's Angels, Fantasy Island, Heart to Heart. I could go on. But those 4 are shows that I remember watching, especially Fantasy Island with people or stars of the week coming in and living out their fantasy on the island with all the little catchphrases in it, like "It's the plane, boss, it's the plane," and all of this sort of stuff. You know, I mean, I'm not very good at impressions or anything, but if that rings bells with you, then that's absolutely brilliant. But let's talk a little bit about Starsky and Hutch. So Paul Michael Glaser is the actor who played David Michael Starsky. He was the dark-haired one, clean cut, a US Army veteran. Had a streetwise manner about him, but he was kind of moody, but in a childlike type moody. You know, if he'd broken up with his girl, he'd be moping about and all of that sort of stuff. So Paul Michael Glaser was the person that sort of like was the more hard-hitting of the two. And then we've got David Soul, whose actual name is, by the way, David Solberg. He played Kenneth Richard Hutch. Now, he was the blonde of the show, handsome. He comes from Minnesota. The intellectual of the two, I would have said. Bit more reserved. I think he actually he moved from Minnesota to this fictional city that looked very much like California, you know, whichever way you look at it, as a divorcee. But I'm not quite sure about that. Both of them were both of them were bachelors, take it like that. And they were undercover cops under the code name Zebra Free. That was something that you heard over their radio all the time. But I would say that the show was characterized by 5 distinct things. They were Starsky and Hutch, obviously. There was a character called Huggy Bear, very important person that we'll talk about in a minute. There was the captain, whose name was Captain Dolby. He was sort of like hard-hitting but fair to an extent. And then, of course, there's the car. And this one had a doozy of a car. It was a Ford Gran Torino, which Paul Michael Glaser nicknamed the Striped Tomato. Or Tomato. Striped Tomato. Which, to be quite honest, we'll talk about again in a little bit, because we're going to talk a little bit about Huggy Bear and why he was important. So he was played by Antonio Fargas. He was always dressed in flashy clothes. He was jive talking, very streetwise, native black American on the streets. I'm pretty sure that they wanted this to look like New York, but it really did look like California to me, which I was never under any dispute on, even at my younger age. And he owned a bar. Now, the bar was named 2 different names, and I don't know quite in which season it changed, but it was called Huggies at first. But then later on it was called the Pits. So at some point he must have moved or just renamed the bar. And then we've got Captain Harold C. Dolby, who was played by Bernie Hamilton. Now, in the show he was played by Bernie Hamilton, but in the pilot film it was Richard Ward. Richard Ward's got a bit more of a gravelly voice. But Captain Dolby was overweight, no nonsense, a distinguished policeman, but you could tell instantly that he was a family man and religious. He had that bent of not going to church on a Sunday, but you could tell that he'd be around his family and be doing things with his family when he wasn't at work. Do you know what I mean? It was never shown in the show, but it was implied. I'm pretty sure. I got a big feeling that he was a family man. And then we've got the Ford Gran Torino itself. It was bright red and a white vector stripe. There was 4 used in the series, and it was nicknamed by Paul as the Striped Tomato. Now, Paul criticised the car from the get-go. He said, "How can we be undercover cops with a bright red car with a white stripe round it?" And he has a point. How can you be undercover cops with the most distinctive car in the whole of the city? Weird. Now, Hutch didn't drive around in a car that I thought was very recognisable, but when I was doing some research, apparently it's a 1973 Ford Galaxy 500. But what I do remember about it, every time I saw it, it was always in a shop or broken down. And apparently the joke in the show was they couldn't use his car for undercover work because when you opened the door, the horn would go off and they could never repair it. So every time you opened the passenger side door, the car horn would go off. Apparently that was an in-joke. So we get to the seasons, and season 1 is considered the hard-hitting first season of the show. It was gritty, character building. Starsky and Hutch sort of like was starting to get to know each other. It was edgy in its language at first, so they used not profanity, but some of the words that we used were very edgy for the time. But what they tried to do was bring in a buddy-buddy element to it. At the end of production, Paul Michael Glaser indicated that he thought the show was too gritty. Definitely thought the subject matter had a lot of violence, and some of the subject matter was not for the time slot that they were in. Now, the music in the first show I want to talk about is because I enjoyed the music in the first series than any other series, and yet the most well-known music is from the second and third season. Now, this was done by a guy called Lalo Schifrin. Now, if anybody has ever watched my earlier blogs, you'll know that Lalo Schifrin is a big influence on me and my music listening. He did lots of the Clint Eastwood films, that I love. But he also did, like Enter the Dragon. But, Magnum Force and Dirty Harry, they all had Lalo Schifrin scores. He was told to write a score to reflect the tone of the show. So it had a gritty intro and outro. And apparently, when the director was doing the film and he was listening to the score, which was a 10-minute part of a car chase in that first 72 minutes, he expanded that part of the film into the main theme, because the film didn't really have a theme. It started off with the credits and so forth, but there really wasn't a theme, not until you get to the seasons, the series as a whole. So we move away from season 1. We've now got our idea of what Starsky and Hutch is, and season 2 continued the buddy aspect of the show, but the writers wanted to show a little bit more of the private life. So emphasis was moving away from being too gritty to being, let's show a little bit about these people, getting to know each other, trusting each other, and being the cops that they were. So from that point of view, when it comes to the music, Tom Scott came in to do the main theme, and he introduced the theme that most people will recognize as Starsky and Hutch. He was asked to lighten the mood. That's basically all he was given. So he brought up a theme which was codenamed Gotcha. It's a very well-known tune. It's been parodied an awful lot. And on my research for finding out about that particular theme, I found out that it was used in a Nintendo game called Treasure Master. Now, this will be one for Panther and the others. The composer of that main theme in that game is Tim Follin. So I actually went and listened, because I have not really got a big NES history. And oh my God, didn't Tim Follin do a fantastic version of the Star Trek and Hutch theme? My God, absolutely wonderful. Recommend you go and look that up. Absolutely brilliant. I didn't know that, and I know quite a little bit about C64 themes, music, SID, all of that sort of stuff, and of course about Tim Follin. Brilliant though. So now we're moving between season 2 and 3. Now this is where Paul Michael Glaser was getting very disenchanted by his character. He indicated he wanted to quit due to the violence in the scenes. The year's 1977, and the critics had noticed as well that the violence in the scenes was going a little bit over the top. He even sued the producers to get across that he did not want to be in this show anymore. So instead of actually letting him release from a hit show and release him from his contract, what they did was they gave him a little bit more to do. So the writers went away, changed the stories to be more buddy-buddy and less gritty, and they gave Paul Michael Glaser more to do. So this is what they did. They gave him an offer to direct certain episodes in that season. They also increased his pay from $5,000 an episode to $35,000 an episode. And some of these seasons had 20 to 26 episodes a season at $35,000 an episode. I think that's a pretty big incentive to stay. Now, when I was researching this, there wasn't an awful lot about what David Soul's opinion was of this, but we'll talk more about David Soul a little bit later on. What happened in season 3 and moving to season 4 is the music again was changed to a person called Mark Snow, and all he did was a variation of the original Gotcha theme. So he just changed some interest in some instruments, the tempo of the theme, and so that's why people still remember the theme for these seasons in 2 and 3, because you heard the music that many more times than you did the first season. So then when we get to seasons between seasons 3 and 4, and by the way, season 4 is the final season, so there is no season 4 to 5. Paul again expressed his want to leave. Now the producers were getting a bit sick of this, I think, after a while. So what they started to do was start to think about the idea of writing the character out. So there was a later episode where Starsky was fighting for his life. In fact, I think it was the last episode, and this is due to a possibly him leaving. But what they did do was they rewrote it and made it that Starsky would live. And the reason for that was because they knew that this would go into syndication, because syndication was now becoming a big thing in America. They didn't want people to be confused on who Starsky was if they ever revived the show, or get confused over which season you were watching, because the character had suddenly changed. So that's why he lived at the end of that season. But they were even thinking about this as earlier on as the 4th episode, because they introduced an episode called Starsky's Brother, and it was episode 4. That was going to be the intention of the new character to be written in for season 5, and that Starsky was going to die at the end of season 4. Okay, so season 5 never happened. By this point, it had been parodied so many times, but the show was becoming stale. It was too now similar to other shows. All the things that made it a hit show with its uniqueness and violent subject matter was now every day in our TV of that time in America, apparently. That's what I read. So it went into syndication in 1980. Now in the UK, just want to talk about the UK for a moment. In its time, there was too many episodes that were gritty that the BBC, which is where it was being shown, didn't edit it to death. So a 50-minute show could be down to 42 minutes, as much as that. There's even an episode that was banned. So season 1 had an episode called The Fix, and it was about heroin intake. That was banned apparently in the UK until its first showing, which was on Channel 5 in 1999. So think about it. We had it from 1980, I think I remember telling you. No, it's 1976. The BBC had it and repeated it every now and again. And they did not show that episode from 1976 until 1999. Banned. Totally. Didn't know that. So this is at a time where you didn't really research things on the internet, because my internet use was mid-90s, so I could have done, but I might not have done, because I probably didn't really look up old shows like this anymore. I was more interested with what was going on in the now, which is probably what I should do a bit more now. But anyway, the legacy of Starsky and Hutch. So a film of it was made in 2004. A game was made on it based on the TV series a year earlier in 2003, and it was on all major consoles. And yes, I remember playing that on the Xbox, and it was not great, if I remember rightly. A season-by-season box set came out of Starsky and Hutch on DVD between 2004 to 2006, and then at the end of 2006 at Christmas they did a complete collection box. I do not believe it's on Blu-ray. And now we move just to two little things about the main actors, because they went on to be quite big stars in themselves, but Starsky and Hutch will always be where they came from. And David Soul, so he got the part of playing Hutch after filming Magnum Force with Clint Eastwood, part of the Dirty Harry scenes. They were so impressed with his policeman character in Magnum Force that he was easily going to be Hutch in the show. In fact, they found his character and wrote his character based around him saying yes. But he started his career in 1966 as a singer called the Covered Man. Now, I'm not going to go into too much depth here because there is a documentary that I found a lot of this information in called I Am Not Hutch, which is on YouTube. Okay? But basically, because of his singing career, which didn't last very long, during the middle of Starsky and Hutch, he revisited his singing career and came out with a number of hits that were even hits in the UK. He came out with a couple of songs, Don't Give Up on Us Baby and Silver Lady, in 1977. In fact, he had one #1 hit in the UK, 5 UK top 20 hits, and 2 albums between 1976 and 1982. So this would be on top of him getting 35,000 an episode in the show. And he was also heavily praised for his playing of Ben Mears in the TV movie Salem's Lot. Salem's Lot is very big for me, one of my favourite horrors of all time, and David Soul, I have to turn around and say what a phenomenal actor he was in that. He really was very good. But we talked an awful lot about Paul Michael Glaser, but there's not that many documentaries on him. He got the part based on David Soul's opinion of his acting. They'd met once before. He remembered him, said he'd be perfect to Starsky, and that started off the Starsky and Hutch buddy side of things. But Paul Michael Glaser is not considered much now for his acting, more of his directing. I knew for a fact that, yes, he had directed The Running Man, because when it came up on the screen, directed Paul Michael Glaser, I went, what? Starsky has directed this film? And I loved The Running Man, so I thought to myself, hey, pretty good. And I suppose I did, like, in the back of my mind, recognise that Paul Michael Glaser came up as director in certain episodes, because the same thing was happening in Quincy and Petrocelli. Actors would direct certain episodes. It certainly happened in Frasier. So why it wouldn't be happening in the 70s, it got to happen. So he also did a film called Cutting Edge, which was about some ice skaters in 1992. But he's directed some fantastic TV stuff. So he's done episodes on Miami Vice, Amazing Stories, Third Watch, Las Vegas. These are all shows from around about the 80s and the 90s. And then we have the sad side of things. So where David Soul has also hit the self-destruct button, been through 5 marriages, alcohol's got to him, drugs has got to him, and basically it's destroyed his career, but he's in a happy place at the moment. Paul Michael Glaser has also had his tragedies. His first wife contracted HIV after a blood transfusion, giving their first babies on birth, and their first child was a girl called Ariel. Now, they didn't know that that this HIV disease had been given to them via a blood transfusion until 4 years later, where they went for a test because the family suddenly got ill. Paul wasn't ill, but Paul's wife and Ariel fell ill at the same time, and after tests they found out they were HIV positive, and all through that blood transfusion. And in those 4 years, Paul had had another child called Jake. And when he was tested, he also was found to be HIV positive. The sad news is that Ariel died before the age of 4. Before the age of 6. So basically not very old at all. And his wife died in 1994, so she didn't live too far forward either. The good news is that Jake survives to this day. He's HIV positive and is leading a normal life. And that ends Starsky and Hutch. And there was a lot of research, and the reason I did Starsky and Hutch is it was important to my childhood. I did love the excitement of the cop shows. I have got all of the DVDs just to show that I didn't just watch this on digital media or that. I've watched it on TV, I've watched it on DVD, and to be quite honest, cops shows like that, like Kojak and a number that I might bring up as topics, heavily influenced me. And then just quickly, we're just going to go through what I've bought this week. Sorry, I keep going out of the scope of this camera. It's nothing to do with the reflection, which was better last week, by the way. This week I bought Groundhog Day. Hope that comes into focus, because that's just come out on Steelbook, because Groundhog Day is in February, so we're not far away from it. Anybody that knows Groundhog Day knows that that's a very, very funny film. One of my favourites. And it's so sarcastic. It's just brilliant, like Scrooged. And then we've got the release of Black Adam, which is released to the world this week. Not into my DC characters. It's a Steelbook. I'm sure it's entertaining. There's only a small pound difference between the Steelbook and a normal 4K release, so I bought the Steelbook. And then lastly, another of my omnibuses turned up, and as I told you last week, they're very sporadic. I pre-ordered them, I don't know when they're coming. This one is The Amazing Spider-Man, the Nick Spencer run, which is only a couple of years old. In fact, I've got all of the comics that are inside this tomb. I didn't need to buy this. But as you know, Spider-Man is something that I buy doubles of. This protects my comics, and it means that I can read the stories again all from within this tomb. And it's a big tomb at that. Same sort of deal. It's a very expensive book, $125. It's got over 1,300 pages in it. Half that price, so you're getting closer to a $70 mark, and then change the $70 into pound sterling, and you'll find that I bought this book around about the 65 pound mark. The end. I hope this was entertaining. I certainly enjoyed the topic. I hope I get good feedback on that. It has gone over. I recognise that, but the topic was an important one for me. One of the shows that I watched as a kiddie that I couldn't wait to watch late at night on BBC. And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Salute, and here's to the next blog next week. Bye-bye.